Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The Trans-Pecos. I've been a game warden for Texas Parks and Wildlife in the Trans-Pecos for 17 years. I want to tell you what's out there. The Trans-Pecos is the part of Texas that doesn't look like what people picture when they picture Texas. No oil derricks, no cattle ranches stretching to the horizon, no Gulf Coast humidity. What the Trans-Pecos is desert, specifically the Chihuahuan Desert, the largest desert in North America, covering this part of West Texas and extending down into Mexico, punctuated by mountain ranges that rise dramatically from the desert floor, sky islands of pine and oak and aspen at elevations surrounded by the desert's creosote and lechuguilla and ocotillo below. The Chisos Mountains in Big Bend National Park, the Davis Mountains, the Guadalupe Mountains on the New Mexico border, and between them, the longest stretches of absolutely empty country that exists east of the Rockies. My territory covers a chunk of this landscape that would qualify as genuinely remote by the standards of any state in the Union. Portions of my patrol area have no maintained road, no permanent resident, no cell service, and no reasonable expectation of any of those things changing in the foreseeable future. The nearest town to some sections of my territory is a 90-minute drive on good road, and getting there from the field means an hour of Ranch Caliche before you hit the pavement. I've run calls that put me on foot in country where the nearest structure of any kind was 12 miles in whatever direction I chose to walk. The work in the Trans-Pecos is different from game warden work in other parts of Texas in ways that matter for what I'm about to tell you. In the hill country or the piney woods, you're working dense, populated country where you're rarely more than 20 minutes from a county road and almost always within radio range of backup. In the Trans-Pecos, you're working country that is genuinely vast and genuinely empty, where the scale of the landscape has a specific quality, an enormity that you feel physically, not just intellectually, and where the things that live in it have had minimal exposure to human activity across most of the territory. The wildlife in the Trans-Pecos is extraordinary. Black bear in the mountains, more of them than most Texans know about, a healthy population that the isolation of the region has allowed to persist and in recent decades expand. Mountain lion throughout, at densities that would alarm most urban Texans. Pronghorn in the desert basins, mule deer in the mountains, javelina everywhere, desert bighorn sheep in the most remote canyon systems. And birds. The Trans-Pecos is one of the most significant birding areas in North America because the convergence of desert and mountain and the proximity to Mexico produces a species diversity that nowhere else in Texas approaches. I know all of this intimately, as 17 years of working the same territory produces. I know where the bear are moving in spring, which mountain springs the lion use in summer drought, where the pronghorn concentrate in cold weather, which canyon systems hold bighorn. I know the sounds of each of these species in their different behavioral states, and I know the signs they leave in different terrain types and conditions. I know my territory with the specific, embodied knowledge that comes from years of patient, attentive presence in a specific place. What I've found in that territory, across 17 years, is something I've kept largely to myself for reasons that I think anyone who's worked remote law enforcement in the American Southwest would understand without much explanation. The Trans-Pecos is a place with its own traditions, its own knowledge systems, its own understanding of what lives in the desert and the mountains that the formal wildlife management literature has only partially captured. And what I've found connects to those traditions in ways that I didn't expect when I took the posting 17 years ago as a young warden excited to work some of the most spectacular landscape in the state. I need to tell you about the cattle. In my third year in the territory, I started getting complaints from ranchers about cattle losses they couldn't attribute to any known predator. This is not unusual in lion country. Depredation complaints are part of the job. I investigate them. I look for sign. I document what I find and advise accordingly. What was unusual about the losses in the specific complaints I'm describing was what the ranchers described when I asked them to characterize the damage. Mountain lion kills look a specific way. So do bear kills and coyote pack kills and the occasional feral dog kill. I've seen all of these across 17 years, and I know what each of them looks like with the certainty that comes from direct, repeated observation. What the ranchers in the central part of my territory were describing, and what I found when I investigated, didn't match any of those patterns. The first rancher I'll call Martinez. He'd been running cattle on a section of the Chihuahuan Desert basin south of the Davis Mountains for 30 years, the kind of multi-generation operation that knows its country the way I know mine, through long family presence in a specific piece of landscape. He'd been dealing with lion depredation for decades, and he knew exactly what it looked like. What he was finding wasn't it. He described the losses as follows. Cattle found in the early morning, in areas they'd been visible and apparently normal in the previous evening's check, dead or gravely injured in ways that didn't match the predation patterns he knew. The kills were not cached. Mountain lion cached their kills, pulling the carcass to cover and returning to feed over several days. The kills were not surrounded by the characteristic signs of a struggle that lion attacks produce in cattle, which are considerable given the size difference. And the specific damage to the animals was something Martinez declined to describe in detail, but that he said was wrong in a way he'd never seen and didn't have a name for. I investigated. I found what Martinez had found, and I spent an afternoon going through my professional reference materials for large predator kill patterns, and I couldn't place what I was looking at in any of them. I noted it in my depredation report as attack mechanism inconsistent with known predators in the region, investigated but source undetermined, and moved on. Over the following 3 years, I received 7 more similar complaints from ranchers spread across a 50-mile section of the central Trans-Pecos. Each was in a slightly different location. Each had the same basic profile, kills that didn't match any known predator, with no identifiable animal sign at the scene, in terrain and at hours that made the absence of trackable sign difficult to account for. I kept all 7 in a folder on my patrol computer. I cross-referenced the locations. They weren't random. They clustered in a specific section of the Central Territory, a rough corridor running northeast to southwest between 2 mountain ranges, corresponding to what I knew as one of the more remote sections of my area, the section with the least road access and the fewest regular human visitors. I was building a picture without knowing what picture I was building. That changed in year 5. Year 5 was when I had my first direct encounter. I was on a pre-dawn patrol in the desert basin, the kind of early start I make regularly during hunting season when I want to be positioned before legal shooting light. I was on a ranch road, making my way toward a windmill stock tank where I planned to observe the area for any illegal activity during the opening hours of deer season. The road was dirt, the conditions were dry, no moon but a sky full of stars that the Trans-Pecos produces at that elevation and that distance from any light pollution. Approximately infinite stars in a sky that looks nothing like what most Americans see at night. At around 4:30 in the morning, approximately 2 miles from the windmill, something crossed the road in front of my truck. I was moving slowly on the dirt road, maybe 15 miles per hour, headlights on, and whatever crossed the road had enough distance ahead of me that my lights caught it well before I reached the crossing point. I braked, not because it crossed close enough to require braking, but because I stopped instinctively when I saw it. In the Trans-Pecos, you see things cross roads at night that you don't see in most of the country. Mountain lion are not uncommon. Bear are rare, but not unheard of. Javelina cross roads in groups at all hours. Mule deer are constant. I've had a desert bighorn cross a remote road on 3 separate occasions across 17 years, which is enough of a sighting to be memorable each time. I know what all of these look like in headlights, and I know the specific visual signature of each. What crossed the road in my headlights at 4:30 in the morning in year 5 was none of them. It was upright, bipedal, moving in a sustained upright gait with the ease and the stride length of something habitually bipedal rather than something temporarily bipedal. It was tall, and here I want to be precise about what tall means in the context of a desert road with a known reference. The caliche road I was on was flanked by typical Chihuahuan Desert vegetation, primarily lechuguilla and ocotillo and desert shrub that I know the height of and relative to those plants and the road cut itself. What I was looking at was well over 6 feet and moving with a body proportion that wasn't human and wasn't any primate I'd ever seen. The arms were long. The stride was wrong in a specific way. The stride length was too great for the height, as though whatever was walking that road had proportions that placed its center of mass differently from where a human being's center of mass is, producing a gait that covered more ground per stride than the height alone should have allowed. It crossed the road in perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, moving from my left to my right, and it crossed without running, without the flight response of a startled animal, at a pace that was purposeful rather than reactive. And as it reached the far side of the road and stepped off the caliche into the desert, I had a clear view of its profile for perhaps 1 second in which I noted the head, which was wrong in a way I've struggled to describe precisely. Not wrong in its position or its basic configuration, but wrong in its proportion relative to the body, in the way the neck connected to it, in something about the overall silhouette that the human face recognition system flags as not right before any specific analysis catches up. Then it was in the desert and my headlights were on empty road. I sat there for close to 5 minutes. Then I drove to the crossing point and got out with my flashlight and looked at the road surface where it had stepped. The caliche was hard and dry and didn't show clear impressions, but at the edge of the road where the surface transitioned to loose desert soil, I found 2 partial impressions that I photographed and that I've kept in my files since. They were bipedal impressions, large, and they didn't match any track in my reference materials. I finished the patrol. I wrote nothing in the patrol log except my normal patrol notes. I drove home after my shift and sat on my back porch in the early morning light and thought about 17 years of professional wildlife work and what I'd just seen, and I started thinking about the cattle losses. A corridor. The cattle losses clustered in a corridor. The road crossing I'd just witnessed was at the south end of that corridor. What I'd seen crossing the road at 4:30 in the morning, moving purposefully through the desert in the direction of the corridor, was moving as though it knew where it was going. I want to tell you about Eduardo, because Eduardo is the person whose knowledge made everything else in this account make sense. Eduardo is a vaquero, a working cowboy in the traditional sense of that word, who has worked cattle on ranches in the central Trans-Pecos his entire life, following his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather into the same work in the same landscape. He was in his mid-60s when I met him in year 6, and he'd been working the specific section of the Trans-Pecos basin that corresponds to my patrol corridor since his 20s. He knew that country the way I've described other people knowing their territories, by feel, by history, by the specific, layered, multi-generational knowledge that long family presence in a specific landscape produces. I met Eduardo through a rancher contact when I was doing a depredation investigation on a ranch where he worked. We got to talking over lunch in the way that ranch work produces, where time is taken for food and the conversation that comes with it, and at some point, in the way these things happen, the conversation arrived at what I'd been thinking about for a year. I didn't bring it up directly. I mentioned the depredation pattern, the losses that didn't fit any predator profile I knew, the corridor. Eduardo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the measured Spanish-inflected English of a man who chose his words carefully in both languages, "You know what my grandfather called that country?" I said I didn't. He said, the grandfather's grandfather called it the old man's road. The corridor you're describing, they knew not to be in it at certain times. Not because of mountain lion or bear, because of something else. He didn't say more than that at lunch, but he came to find me before I left the ranch that afternoon, and he told me more. And what he told me was the context that the formal wildlife management literature had never given me, and that 17 years of patrol data had been pointing toward without being able to name. The corridor I'd been tracking was a known feature of the Trans-Pecos landscape in the traditional knowledge of the families who'd worked that section for generations, going back before the Anglo settlement of the region and through it and beyond it, persistent in the knowledge across every wave of human activity in that landscape. Not always called the old man's road, different families, different generations, different languages had given it different names. But the knowledge of what it was had persisted, a section of the desert basin that something used as a travel route, something large and old that moved through the desert at night on a path that had been its path for longer than any human memory went back. Eduardo's family had known about it for 4 generations that he could document. He suspected longer. The traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples who'd known that desert before the vaqueros and before the Anglo ranchers had its own account of the same territory, he said, though he'd only heard pieces of it from an old Mescalero Apache man he'd known decades ago who'd worked briefly on one of the ranches and who had, in a single conversation on a particular evening, described the corridor and what used it with a specificity that Eduardo had found both confirming and unsettling, because the Apache man's description matched his own family's knowledge in ways that the two traditions could only have arrived at through independent, direct observation of the same thing. 2 traditions, 1 corridor. The same essential account across the full span of human presence in that landscape. Eduardo said the corridor was a route. The thing that used it was moving between 2 places, both of which were in the mountain ranges that flanked the desert basin, and the corridor through the basin was the desert crossing between those 2 places. The movement through the corridor happened at night, seasonally, in a pattern that his grandfather had described as predictable enough to know approximately when the corridor would be active and approximately when it would be quiet. The cattle losses his family had experienced across generations always corresponded to the active seasons. It had a seasonal range. It moved between mountain ranges. It crossed the desert basin on a specific route at specific times of year. Eduardo's family had learned the pattern well enough to manage around it, keeping cattle out of the corridor during the active seasons, the same way you'd manage around any large predator's known behavior. And the management had worked well enough that the losses were relatively infrequent during his grandfather's and father's tenures, because the management was informed by good knowledge of the pattern. What had changed in recent years, producing the complaints I'd been investigating, was a disruption of the management knowledge. The older generation that had carried the specific, detailed knowledge of the corridor's active seasons had died or moved away, and the working knowledge hadn't fully transferred to the newer generation of ranch workers, who didn't have the context to understand why certain sections of the range were handled differently at certain times of year. Without that context, the cattle were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the losses followed. I asked Eduardo whether he'd ever seen it directly. He said once, at dusk, 30 years before, on a ridge above the corridor. He'd been tracking a stray heifer and had come over the ridge at the wrong time and seen something moving through the desert below. He described it in terms I recognized from my own road crossing observation: tall, upright, wrong proportions, moving with a certainty and a pace that suggested a route known thoroughly rather than terrain being navigated for the first time. He'd gone back down the ridge the way he'd come and had not told anyone about it for years, and when he'd eventually told his father had said, in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man confirming a known fact, "You saw the old man." The old man. In his family's telling, the name wasn't derogatory or dismissive. It was the name for something very old in a landscape that had many old things in it, distinguished from the other old things by its scale and its nature and its presence in a specific section of the desert that every generation of his family had learned to treat with appropriate care. Year 7 produced the most sustained direct experience I've had in 17 years in the corridor. I was running a night patrol through the central section on horseback. There are sections of the Trans-Pecos backcountry that are more practically accessed on horseback than by vehicle, and this was one of them, a section of desert wash and rocky bench land that would have been slow and hard on a truck, and that horses handled more naturally. My horse, a bay quarter horse I'd been working with for 3 years and who had the steady, reliable temperament of a working horse with extensive backcountry experience, started behaving unusually about 40 minutes into the night patrol in the corridor. Not dramatically. Working horses develop the specific, controlled expression of unease that is different from panic, a heightened attention and a reluctance to continue in a specific direction without pushing that tells an experienced rider something is in the environment that the horse wants information about before proceeding. I've ridden horses in mountain lion country for years. I know what lion spook looks like and how to handle it. This wasn't it. Lion spook in a well-trained working horse produces a specific response that an experienced rider learns to read. What I was feeling through the horse was different, not the reactive alertness of a prey animal that has detected an immediate predator threat, but something more sustained and more directional. The horse wanted to know about something in a specific direction, to the north and slightly west of our route, and was reluctant to proceed past a point that corresponded to where our route would take us closest to that direction. I gave the horse time. A working horse that's telling you something is telling you something, and the appropriate response is to listen, not to push past the horse's assessment. We stood still in the desert wash for close to 10 minutes. The horse's attention consistently oriented north-northwest, and in that 10 minutes I heard nothing and saw nothing, but the horse did not relax. Then, from the north-northwest, there was a sound. Low, organized, sustained, the same register I've described in other contexts, but with a quality specific to open desert that those other contexts hadn't had. Desert carries sound differently from forest. There's no canopy to absorb it, no understory to scatter it, just open air and rock and the immense stillness of a desert night. And sound in those conditions travels with a clarity and a volume that can be disorienting until you're used to it. What I heard from the north-northwest was clear in a way that let me place it more precisely than I'd been able to place sounds in other contexts. Maybe 400 meters, on the bench land above the wash, moving on a parallel course to mine, in the same direction of travel I'd been heading before the horse stopped, at a pace that matched approximately the walking pace the horse and I had been maintaining. It was pacing us. I stayed still for close to 20 minutes. The sound continued, intermittently, from the same general bearing, moving parallel. At no point did it change its distance from us or move toward us. It maintained the same 400-meter separation, the same direction of travel, the same intermittent pattern for the full 20 minutes, and then it stopped, and I heard nothing more. The horse relaxed incrementally after the sound stopped. Not immediately. It took close to 5 minutes for the horse to drop its head and resume the normal, relaxed attention of a working horse in ordinary conditions. Whatever we'd been hearing, the horse's assessment of its proximity and its nature had changed after it stopped, and the change in the horse corresponded exactly to the change in what I could detect with my own less finely tuned senses. I turned around and rode out. I made a decision that night, riding back through the desert wash under a sky beginning to show the first gray of pre-dawn, that I was going to take Eduardo's knowledge seriously as the most complete picture of what was in that corridor, and that I was going to manage my own behavior in that territory accordingly. No more solo night patrols in the central corridor during the active seasons. When I had to be in the central section after dark for any reason, not alone. I've held to that decision for the 10 years since. I want to tell you about year 9, because year 9 was the year the picture became complete enough that I could stop wondering whether I was misinterpreting what I'd been seeing. I was doing a GPS mapping project, charting the locations of the depredation incidents in my files against the topographic and habitat data for the corridor. This was formal work, the kind of spatial analysis that wildlife managers do routinely to understand the pattern of predator-prey interactions in a specific area. What I was trying to do, officially, was characterize the predation pressure in the corridor for a report I was writing on black bear and mountain lion impacts on cattle operations in the central Trans-Pecos. The spatial analysis showed me a pattern I wasn't formally analyzing for. The depredation locations, when mapped against the topography, produced a linear distribution that followed the wash and bench land system of the corridor almost exactly, from the southwest end where the terrain opened into the basin to the northeast end where it rose toward the base of the mountains. The distribution was too linear to be random, too consistent across 11 years of incidents to be coincidental variation in predator activity, and too precisely aligned with the corridor's terrain features to be explained by any predator ecology I knew. It was a map of a route, a specific, consistent, repeated route through the desert basin, traceable in 11 years of depredation data with a precision that could only be produced by something moving through that corridor repeatedly, on the same general path, with the consistency of an established travel route rather than the variable, habitat-driven movement of any predator I was formally studying. I printed the map and I took it to Eduardo. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he said, "That's the old man's road." He put his finger on the map, tracing the distribution of the depredation incidents, and he traced the same line that the data described. And then he lifted his finger and tapped a specific point near the northeast end of the distribution, in the approximate location of a canyon system that climbed toward one of the mountain ranges, and he said, "That's where it goes in." That's where it goes in. An old Mescalero Apache man, for decades before, had told him the same thing about the same canyon. His grandfather had told him. The depredation data from 11 years of my own monitoring, generated by a formal wildlife management process designed to understand mountain lion and black bear, had independently produced a map that described the same route that Eduardo's family's 4-generation knowledge described. The data mapped onto the traditional knowledge. The traditional knowledge mapped onto the data. Two completely separate knowledge-producing systems, one institutional and one familial, one generated by GPS coordinates and formal incident reports, and one generated by generations of careful attention in a specific landscape, describing the same thing in the same place with the same precision. I've sat with that for 8 years. Now let me tell you about the canyon, because the canyon is where this account needs to go next. Eduardo pointed to the canyon at the northeast end of the corridor on my map. I knew the canyon. It was in my patrol territory. I'd been in it on multiple occasions. It was remote, even by Trans-Pecos standards, accessible only by a serious hike from the nearest trailhead, and it saw maybe a handful of recreational visitors in an entire year. The canyon had a permanent spring deep in its interior, one of the scarce sources of reliable water in that section of the mountains, and the spring supported a green zone of cottonwood and willow and the specific, dense, semi-tropical vegetation that water produces in desert mountains. I went to the canyon in year 10, specifically to look at what Eduardo had described. Not the spring, which I'd visited before, but the section of canyon above the spring, where the canyon walls narrowed and the terrain became more technical, and where, in all my previous visits, I'd stopped and turned around at the practical limit of easy solo hiking. Above the spring, the canyon walls were sandstone and limestone, streaked with the dark mineral stains of long water exposure, and in the sections of the canyon floor where alluvial deposits had accumulated, the ground was soft and held impressions well. I was in the canyon in mid-morning, good light, conditions that made careful observation easy. I found impressions in the alluvial deposits of the canyon floor above the spring. Multiple sets, not from a single visit. The layering of the deposit showed different depth strata, suggesting impressions laid down at different times, some more recent, and some weathered to the point of being only partially legible. The impressions were bipedal, large, and in the freshest examples clear enough to show the basic shape and proportion I've been describing throughout this account. I spent 3 hours in that canyon, photographing and measuring what I found. The photographs are in my personal files, not in any official record. I've shown them to 2 people. Eduardo looked at them and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Yes." A wildlife photographer who specializes in track documentation looked at them and said, with more hedging than Eduardo but more certainty than I'd expected, "Those are bipedal, they're large, and I don't know what made them." The canyon above the spring is where the route ended, where Eduardo's family knowledge said it went, where the Apache man had said it went, where the depredation data's northeast terminus pointed, and where the alluvial deposits of the canyon floor had been recording, in layers of compressed desert soil, the passage of something large and bipedal over more visits than I could count from what was visible in the deposit. I went to the canyon again in year 12 and year 15. Each time I went far enough to document what was in the canyon's lower and middle sections, and each time I stopped at the same approximate point in the upper canyon, where the walls narrowed and the terrain required me to commit to a direction without good visibility. Each time, the same preconscious, clear-as-speech instruction arrived. Stop here. This is the limit. I've stopped each time. I want to describe the active season more specifically, because Eduardo's account of it was one of the most practically useful pieces of information I received from that conversation, and I've been able to cross-reference it against my depredation data in a way that has confirmed its accuracy to a degree that still strikes me as remarkable. In Eduardo's family's knowledge, the corridor was active primarily from mid-March through late May, and again from September through November. The summer months and the deep winter months showed reduced activity, corresponding to the extremes of the desert climate when even the most adapted desert organisms modify their behavior to accommodate the temperature range. The shoulder seasons, spring and fall, were the active periods, corresponding to what I know as the migration and movement seasons for wildlife broadly in the Chihuahuan Desert, when things that range across the desert basin tend to be in transit between seasonal ranges. When I overlaid Eduardo's active season windows against my 11 years of depredation data, the correspondence was striking. The depredation incidents in the corridor clustered in the spring and fall windows with a consistency that had a p-value when I ran the formal statistical analysis that would be publishable in any wildlife management journal as evidence of a seasonal behavioral pattern in a predatory species. The data independently confirmed the traditional knowledge. The traditional knowledge independently confirmed the data. I've published wildlife management analyses with weaker statistical support than what the depredation data in the corridor produces when you overlay it against the seasonal pattern Eduardo described. The animal, and I'm going to keep using that word because it's the most accurate frame I have, whatever the species may be, has a predictable seasonal movement pattern that spans at minimum the 4 generations of Eduardo's family's direct observation and probably considerably longer. It moves on a specific route. It uses a specific canyon system as a destination in the northeast. It has a home range large enough to take it between 2 mountain ranges across a desert basin, which is a home range of tens or potentially hundreds of square miles. And it has been doing this, reliably and predictably, for long enough that the knowledge of the pattern is encoded in the oral traditions of multiple cultural groups who've lived in closest relationship with that landscape. This is the ecology of a large, wide-ranging, intelligent animal with an established home range and an established travel corridor. The absence of a species name doesn't change what the behavioral profile is. I want to tell you about the conversation I had in year 11 with a Big Bend National Park ranger I'll call Rodrigo, because Rodrigo added a piece of information I hadn't had before, and that connected the corridor to a larger geographic pattern that I hadn't fully appreciated. Rodrigo had been working backcountry patrol in Big Bend for 12 years and had the specific, deep knowledge of that park's interior that long tenure in genuinely remote territory produces. I met him at a regional law enforcement training in Alpine, and we got talking, the way that game wardens and park rangers who work the same general landscape talk, comparing notes on wildlife and on the informal knowledge that circulates among people who spend serious time in the Trans-Pecos backcountry. At some point I mentioned, carefully, that I'd been tracking an unusual depredation pattern in the central basin north of the park, in a specific corridor that I'd been working for several years. I described the corridor without naming the specifics. Rodrigo was quiet for a moment and then asked where the corridor's southwest end was. I described the terrain. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone fitting a piece into a picture they've been building. He said, "We have a specific section of the park's backcountry that the experienced rangers don't use for overnight camping. It's not an official policy. It's just institutional knowledge. The section runs through the southwest end of the Chihuahuan foothills. Some rangers call it the silent section because of how the wildlife behaves in it, especially at night. The southwest end of the Chihuahuan foothills. On the map I had in my head of the corridor and its terrain, the southwest end corresponded to a point within the park boundary, in exactly the location where the corridor would enter the park if the route continued in the direction the depredation data suggested. The institutional knowledge among Big Bend's backcountry rangers of a section where wildlife behaved unusually and that experienced rangers didn't overnight was describing, from within the park boundary, the same corridor that my data and Eduardo's knowledge were describing from outside it. The corridor extended into Big Bend National Park. The Park Service had its own informal knowledge of the same section of terrain, labeled differently and held in a different institutional context, but describing the same behavioral pattern in the same location. I've spent 6 years since that conversation thinking about what the full geographic extent of the corridor might be. The two mountain range endpoints that Eduardo's family knowledge described, one at the northeast end of my patrol territories corridor, accessible through the canyon above the spring, and one at the southwest end, could theoretically span a range of many tens of miles when you account for the Big Bend section that Rodrigo's institutional knowledge described. A home range of that scale, for a large animal with the behavioral profile I've been documenting, would be consistent with the biology of several large mammal species, grizzly bear, mountain lion, wolf, if those species had a much larger body size than any of them actually achieve. Whatever is in the Trans-Pecos has a home range appropriate to an apex predator considerably larger than anything currently documented in North America's large mammal fauna. I'm going to close this account with what I want you to know if you spend time in the central Trans-Pecos, because I've given you the data and the traditional knowledge and the direct encounters, and the practical consequence of all of it needs to be stated clearly. The corridor exists. It runs through the central Chihuahuan Desert basin between two mountain ranges, and it extends, based on what Rodrigo told me, into Big Bend National Park from the north. The active seasons are spring and fall, peaking in the shoulder season windows. The specific terrain features of the corridor, the wash and bench land system that the depredation data maps, the canyon system at the northeast end, are real and identifiable to anyone with good topographic knowledge of that section of the basin. What I'd want anyone spending time in the central Trans-Pecos to know is what Eduardo's family knew for 4 generations. The corridor is not your territory. Whatever uses it has been using it for longer than any living person's memory goes back, and the appropriate relationship to it is the same relationship that every long-tenured resident of that landscape has eventually arrived at, acknowledging what's there, giving it the space its presence has earned, and not being in that specific section of the desert alone at night during the seasons when the data tells you the corridor is active. If you're in the Trans-Pecos backcountry during spring or fall, in the desert basin between the mountain ranges, and you hear something moving parallel to you in the dark at a distance that doesn't change, stop. Let it do what it's doing. It's on its route. You're not. Turn around when the parallel movement stops and come back to the road and come home. The old man's road has been there since before anyone arrived in that desert to name it. It'll be there after everyone who's currently naming it is gone. The desert is honest about what it contains if you know how to read it. The cattle losses, the depredation data map, the partial impressions at the road edge, the alluvial layers in the canyon above the spring, Eduardo's family knowledge, and the Apache man's description and Rodrigo's institutional awareness, all of it pointing at the same established, old, patient presence in a specific section of the most remote landscape in Texas. Respect the corridor. Know the seasons. Don't be in the central basin alone after dark in March, April, May, September, October, or November. And if you hear the old man passing in the dark beside you, stay still, let him go, and when the desert is quiet again, head home. He was here first. He'll be here last. The desert belongs to him in a way it has never belonged to anyone who came after. Come home from the Trans-Pecos before dark. That's 17 years in the corridor. That's what's out there. I want to go back and describe the depredation pattern in more detail because I've been summary level about it, and the detail matters for what the pattern actually shows. In the 14 complaints I formally investigated in the corridor between year 3 and year 9, the full set before I ran the spatial analysis, the common thread that I identified across all 14 was not the type of damage or the type of animal lost. It was the absence of evidence. Not partial evidence, not ambiguous evidence. Complete absence of any trackable animal sign at or near the scenes and conditions that should have produced sign readily. Predators leave tracks. Every predator that operates in the Trans-Pecos leaves tracks, and the desert soil conditions in the corridor, particularly in the wash bottoms where the soft alluvial material holds impressions well, are among the better tracking conditions in my patrol area. Mountain lion attacks on cattle produce sign that's findable 100 yards from the kill site in conditions far worse than what the corridor offers. Bear kills produce extensive sign. Coyote pack kills are practically mapped in the prints of a dozen animals working the scene. I know what each of these looks like, and I know how far I can expect to find sign from a kill site under different conditions. In all 14 investigations, working outward from the kill or attack site in an expanding search pattern, I found no animal sign consistent with any known predator in the size range capable of taking adult cattle. Not at the site, not in the approaches to the site, not in the escape routes from the site in any direction. In conditions where a mountain lion would have left prints that any competent tracker could follow for hundreds of yards, I found nothing. In conditions where a black bear would have left claw marks on a fence post or a scuff in the caliche, I found nothing. One of the 14 investigations I want to describe specifically because it produced the most detailed record of this absence, and because it was the investigation that most directly convinced me the pattern was real and not the product of my own expectation bias. A rancher I'll call Wilson had lost a yearling heifer overnight, finding her dead at a windmill stock tank in the early morning. The tank was at the southwest edge of the corridor, in terrain with multiple approach routes, a dirt road on one side, open desert on the other, a shallow draw that ran toward the tank from the north. The heifer was found at the waterline, fully visible from multiple directions, in an area that showed her own tracks from the previous day's watering visit. She was dead in a way I'm not going to describe in detail, consistent with the other 14 in the category of not matching any known predator pattern. The tank area had been dry for 6 days before a brief rain 3 days prior to the incident, which meant the soil immediately around the tank had first-rate tracking conditions from the rain moisture, soft, receptive, exactly the conditions where I'd expect to find whatever had approached the tank to have left a clear record. I found Wilson's boot tracks from that morning. I found the heifer's tracks from the previous day's visit. I found the tracks of 3 other cattle that had watered at the same tank in the previous 48 hours based on the track layering. I found a set of tracks from a coyote that had worked the tank area after the rain. I found the tracks of a jackrabbit and what appeared to be a roadrunner working the mud at the waterline. I found nothing else. Nothing that approached the tank from any direction, in soil that would have recorded a bird landing on the waterline, and left the heifer in the state I found her. Whatever had been at that tank with the heifer had left no more trackable sign than a ghost. That investigation, and the completeness of the absence and conditions that made the absence itself remarkable, was what crystallized the pattern for me in a way I couldn't rationalize away. I've tracked animals in the Trans-Pecos for 17 years. I know what the soil holds and what it doesn't hold under different conditions. The soil at that windmill tank, under those conditions, held everything that had been there. Everything except whatever had killed the heifer. The absence of sign is itself a kind of sign. Whatever is in the corridor has a relationship to the desert surface that doesn't produce the trackable record that every other large animal in that ecosystem produces. This is not nothing. It is specific, it is consistent across 14 investigations spanning 6 years, and it is one of the most anomalous single characteristics in the full picture of what the corridor contains. I've thought about what explains this characteristic more than almost any other element of the pattern. The explanations I've entertained: a very large animal with a very light, large footprint that distributes weight across a broader surface and therefore doesn't produce the same impression depth that a concentrated footprint does. A movement pattern that avoids the specific terrain features, the soft soil at waterlines, the wash bottoms, where tracking conditions are best. Or something about how the animal contacts the ground that is different from what I'm accustomed to from every other animal I track, in a way that produces an impression below the threshold of what I can detect. None of these are satisfying. The most honest position I can take is that I don't know why whatever is in the corridor leaves no trackable sign in conditions where everything else in the Trans-Pecos ecosystem does, and that the consistent, cross-investigation absence is more significant as evidence than any positive sign would be, because it is harder to explain away. The pronghorn told me something that the cattle didn't. In year 8, I started paying closer attention to the pronghorn in the corridor, specifically their distribution relative to the corridor's active zone. Pronghorn are my favorite large mammal in the Trans-Pecos. Extraordinary animals, the fastest land mammal in the Western Hemisphere, with a suite of behavioral adaptations to open desert country that make them particularly interesting to observe. They use the desert basin I'm describing extensively in normal years, moving freely across the open terrain between the mountains. Except in the corridor. What I documented across 3 seasons of systematic observation was that the pronghorn herds that used the desert basin on both sides of the corridor avoided the corridor itself with a consistency that produced a visible gap in their distribution, a strip of open desert that should have been well used by pronghorn and wasn't, corresponding almost exactly to the depredation data's linear distribution. The gap wasn't absolute. Individual animals crossed the corridor, particularly at the edges. But the herd-level distribution showed a consistent avoidance of the corridor's center that I could not account for by any habitat or landscape variable I could identify. Pronghorn are prey species. The behavioral ecology of prey species in response to predator pressure is well understood, and what I was observing in the pronghorn's corridor avoidance was consistent with a known predator in the corridor whose behavioral ecology the pronghorn had learned and were responding to appropriately. The avoidance wasn't fear. Pronghorn in the presence of an active predator threat show a different behavioral response, watchful and alert and ready to flee. What the pronghorn were doing was more like what cattle do when they know a bull's territory, staying out of it with the casual certainty of animals that know the boundary and have learned not to push it. They knew the corridor. They'd incorporated it into their movement ecology. And their avoidance was more spatially precise than my depredation data analysis had produced, because the pronghorn are in the desert every day and their movement patterns represent a continuously updated assessment of what the desert contains. I asked Eduardo about the pronghorn specifically at a later conversation. He said, with the faint smile of someone explaining something that should have been obvious, pronghorn know every predator in this country better than any biologist does. If the pronghorn don't go there, you should not go there. He said it in the tone of someone quoting his grandfather, which I believe he was. Know every predator in this country better than any biologist does, including the ones the biologists don't have in their taxonomies. The pronghorn's knowledge of the corridor predates mine and will outlast mine and is more accurate than mine because it's derived from continuous daily presence in the landscape rather than periodic professional visits. I've been learning to read the pronghorn's distribution the way you learn to read any indicator species, as information about the environment rather than simply as data about the pronghorn themselves. The pronghorn are telling you where the corridor is every day with their feet. If you know what you're looking at. I need to describe the Year 13 encounter because it was the most direct interaction I've had in the corridor outside of the Year 5 road crossing, and it was one that had a witness. A deputy county sheriff I've known for most of my tenure was riding with me on a joint patrol in the central Trans-Pecos, the kind of informal cooperation that rural law enforcement in remote counties develops naturally between agencies. We were in his vehicle rather than mine, which meant we were on roads slightly different from my usual patrol routes, in a section of the corridor that I'd always accessed alone. About 40 minutes into the patrol, the deputy's radio produced a burst of static that was unusual in both its character and its timing, a sustained, irregular static that didn't match the normal background interference of Trans-Pecos radio communications, which I know well, and that coincided precisely with the vehicle entering the central section of the corridor. The deputy fiddled with the radio for a moment, trying to clear the interference, and then put it down and said, "Radio does that sometimes out here." I asked if it was specific to this section of road. He paused, and then said, "Yeah, there's a section up here that's always been like this. You get used to it." I asked how long he'd been having radio issues in this section. He said his whole career, going on 15 years, and that every deputy who worked this county had the same experience in this specific section of road. We drove through the section in question, which corresponded to the central part of the corridor, and the radio static cleared when we came out the far side. The deputy noted it without comment. I noted it with considerably more, internally, because radio interference that is consistent, location-specific, and known to 15 years of county law enforcement working that road is an unusual feature of a specific piece of ground, and the list of things that can produce that kind of consistent, location-specific interference is not long. Later in that same patrol, the deputy said something that I want to include here because it adds one more data point to the picture. He mentioned, in the context of an unrelated conversation about local history, that there was an old story in the county about a section of the desert that the original ranching families had called the Old Man's Crossing. He didn't have details. It was a fragment of county history that had reached him as a casual mention from an older local rather than anything with a documented source. He said it in the same way people mention interesting local history, without thinking it was particularly relevant to anything we were doing or talking about. The Old Man's Crossing. Eduardo's grandfather's grandfather had called it the Old Man's Road. An Apache man's description from decades before had its own name for the same corridor. And now the county's historical memory carried another version of the name, in a context so casual and so distant from any deliberate oral tradition that the deputy who mentioned it had no idea what he was referencing or why it might matter. The name persisted across every human cultural system that had been in close enough contact with that section of the desert to develop one. Different languages, different traditions, different degrees of formality and duration. All of them circling the same corridor, the same route, the same presence moving through the desert at night between two mountain ranges for longer than any version of the name has existed. I've been a game warden in the Trans-Pecos for 17 years. I have 17 years of formal monitoring data, one road crossing sighting, one night patrol acoustic encounter with a witness, the horse, the best witness I know, one depredation data map that maps onto 4 generations of traditional knowledge, canyon impressions documented across 3 separate visits. And now the addition of consistent county law enforcement radio anomalies and the county's own buried historical memory of what the corridor is called. What I have is complete. I don't need more data. The picture is as complete as a picture assembled from outside a phenomenon can be, and what the picture shows is what I've been telling you it shows. Something large and old and established in its territory, using a specific route through the central Trans-Pecos on a schedule that the landscape's human residents have been documenting for as long as they've been in that desert. What I don't have is a name. I'm not going to offer one, for the same reason I've declined to offer names in every other account I've given of the things in their respective landscapes. Names carry cultural freight that shapes how people receive information, and the information I'm trying to give you is specific enough and sufficiently supported by independent evidence that it doesn't need a name to be credible. What it needs is to be received accurately, as the account of a 17-year career in one of the most remote landscapes in the continental United States, assembled carefully from direct observation and from the knowledge of people with far longer tenure in that landscape than I have, pointing at something real and established and persistent in the central Chihuahuan Desert of West Texas. Whatever the old man is, he's been walking that road since before anyone now living was born, and he'll be walking it after everyone now living is gone, on his route, on his schedule, through the most extraordinary and most remote desert landscape in this country. Give him his road. That's the only advice that 17 years in the Trans-Pecos has produced that I'm fully confident in. I want to tell you about what I found at the windmill stock tank the morning after the year 11 deer season opener, because it's the most recent piece of direct physical evidence in the corridor, and it was the most clearly documented thing I've collected in 17 years. The tank is the same windmill I mentioned in the Year 5 section, the one I was heading toward on the pre-dawn patrol when I had the road crossing sighting. I've been coming to that windmill for 17 years, and I know it the way you know any specific water source that you've visited hundreds of times. The way the tank sits relative to the surrounding terrain, the usual animal sign around the waterline, the specific mud condition at the tank's edge under different weather conditions. On the morning after the deer season opener, I'd had a patrol call nearby, and I stopped at the windmill to check for sign of night activity. The same routine stop I make at water sources across my territory during the hunting season to assess wildlife movement and check for any indication of illegal activity around the water. The morning was cold, below freezing, with a frost that had formed on the tank's surface and on the vegetation around the waterline. Perfect tracking conditions. Frost preserves impressions in a way that makes them legible for several hours after they're made. At the tank, I found tracks, not the absence I'd been documenting for years in the corridor's depredation investigations. Actual tracks, fresh, in the frost-preserved mud at the tank's waterline, laid down sometime overnight when the temperature had been below freezing and the frost was actively forming. They were bipedal. They came from the northwest, the direction of the corridor's center, approaching the tank on a line that crossed approximately 40 yards of open desert, reaching the waterline, and then returned on the same general line back toward the northwest. There was no hesitation at the tank, no circling, no investigative behavior. The tracks came to the water and went back from the water, as efficiently as any animal approaching a water source with complete familiarity. I measured the tracks, 17 inches in the longest dimension, 8 inches at the widest point, with a depth in the frost-preserved mud that my reference boot produced at a fraction of, suggesting considerably more mass behind each step than my own body weight. The stride between consecutive impressions was close to 5 feet, consistent across the full approach and return trackway. And the toe impression pattern, in the 2 or 3 impressions where it was most clearly preserved, showed 5 toes in an arrangement and proportion that didn't match any large mammal track in my reference materials. I documented everything: photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates for the trackway's endpoints, a sketch of the overall track pattern relative to the tank and the surrounding terrain features. It took me close to 2 hours. When I was finished, I sat by the tank for a while and looked at what I'd documented and thought about 17 years of the corridor, and about Eduardo, and about the old man's road, and about the canyon above the spring. Whatever had come to this windmill overnight had come from the direction of the corridor's center, on its route, in the active season, for water. The same reason everything comes to a windmill in the desert. Water. The most basic, the most ordinary biological need, expressed in tracks that didn't match any known species in 17 years of working the same ground, in frost-preserved mud at a windmill I'd been visiting for the same 17 years. I called Eduardo that afternoon. I described what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "What time of year is it now?" I told him November. He said, "Active season. Are you going to be at the windmill again tonight?" I said I wasn't planning to be. He said, "Good." He said it in the flat, practical tone of a man who'd grown up with the information I'd just arrived at after 17 years and who had never had any reason to be surprised by it, only by the fact that someone trained and equipped to document it hadn't documented it before. Good. Don't be at the windmill overnight during the active season. The same management principle his family had applied for 4 generations, requiring no explanation from me and no further discussion. I haven't been at that windmill overnight during November since. I don't plan to be. I want to describe the landscape itself in a way I haven't done yet, because the Trans-Pecos deserves more careful description than I've given it, and because the landscape's specific character is part of what makes the presence of what I've been describing feel coherent rather than anomalous. The Chihuahuan Desert is not the kind of desert most people picture from popular culture. It's not sand dunes and empty flat plains. It's a high-elevation desert, mostly above 3,500 feet, in places above 5,000 feet, with a scrubby, spiny, extraordinarily diverse vegetation community that is one of the most species-rich arid land ecosystems in the world. The dominant visual texture is the gray-green of creosote and the silver-blue of desert grasses, punctuated by the straw yellow of lechuguilla and the tall, candelabra forms of sotal and yucca. In the spring, after rains, it blooms with a density and diversity that is genuinely startling if you haven't seen a Chihuahuan desert spring before. What the landscape has, in the sections of the basin that see the least human activity, is a quality of age. Not geological age, which is present everywhere in that landscape, and which you feel in the exposed limestone and the basalt intrusions and the ancient alluvial fans. A different kind of age, the age of a place that has been doing what it does, without interruption, for longer than the human activity in the region can document. The creosote in the central Trans-Pecos basin includes some of the oldest living organisms in North America. Individual creosote clones that have been in place for thousands of years, expanding slowly outward from an original seed germination, occupying the same patch of desert for longer than any human institution. When you walk through a Chihuahuan desert basin in the central Trans-Pecos, you're walking through a landscape that has been occupied by the same biological community, more or less, for a span of time that makes any human presence in that landscape look like a brief interruption. Whatever has been moving through the corridor in that landscape has been moving through it on a timescale that fits the landscape's own timescale. Not a century, not 4 generations, not 17 years of my observation or 100 years of Anglo ranching. A timescale appropriate to a creature in a landscape where the plants are thousands of years old and the landscape itself has been doing what it does since before any human memory. The Trans-Pecos has that quality of belonging to its own timescale rather than to ours, in a way that only a very few landscapes I've worked in approach. The Chihuahuan Desert in the Central Basin, away from the roads and the windmills and the infrequent structures, has a kind of time in it that is different from the time and places with a denser human history. You feel it. The silence has a depth to it that isn't simply absence of noise. It's the specific weight of time in a place that has been silent for long stretches, interrupted briefly, and returned to silence. In that kind of landscape, the idea that something has been moving through the corridor since before any living person's memory is not surprising. It's appropriate. It fits the landscape's own scale. The old man's road is as old as the desert basin it crosses, and the desert basin has been what it is for much longer than any of us have been in it. I'm going to close this account with a specific piece of advice, and then with something I want to say about why the Trans-Pecos is worth knowing about on its own terms, even with everything I've described. The specific advice: if you're in the central Trans-Pecos in the spring or fall, in the desert basin between the mountain ranges north of Big Bend, and you notice that the pronghorn herds aren't using a section of the open basin that the habitat says they should be using, pay attention to that. The pronghorn are the most accurate real-time map of what the landscape contains. Where they're not going, there's a reason. And the reason in the central Trans-Pecos basin, in the section I've been describing, is 17 years of depredation data and 4 generations of vaquero knowledge, and the Apache man's description, and the windmill tracks, and the canyon impressions, and the year 5 road crossing, all saying the same thing about the same place. Where the pronghorn don't go in the central Trans-Pecos basin, the old man's road runs. And the old man's road is not your road. The Trans-Pecos itself, the wider landscape, the Davis Mountains and the Chizos and the Guadalupe, the desert basin with its extraordinary ecology, the night sky that is among the darkest in the contiguous United States, the wildlife that has the specific character of truly wild things in a truly remote landscape, is one of the extraordinary places in North America and is worth any effort it takes to experience it. The presence of the thing I've been describing is part of what that landscape is, and the appropriate response to it is the same response that every living tradition that has known that desert has settled on. Acknowledge it, give it its road, don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The desert is old. Whatever is in it is older. The pronghorn have been right about it since before anyone else arrived. Trust the pronghorn. Come home from the Trans-Pecos before dark. The old man's road is his. Let me describe the mountain lion comparison more precisely, because it's the comparison I keep coming back to when I'm trying to explain to myself and to others why what I've been documenting in the corridor doesn't fit any known predator. A mountain lion in my patrol territory has a home range of roughly 50 to 150 square miles for a male, smaller for females. I track the lions in my area through camera data, kill sites, and the informal network of rancher observation that constitutes a significant part of my intelligence on large predator movement in the Trans-Pecos. I know the lions in my area reasonably well in the aggregate, not individually, but well enough to have a functional picture of the population distribution and the territory boundaries of the major males. What distinguishes lion behavior from what I've been documenting in the corridor is specificity. Lion territories are not corridors. They're territories, areas of space that a lion patrols systematically, covering multiple terrain features, multiple prey habitat types, multiple water sources, in patterns that cover the full range of the territory across a period of days or weeks. A lion doesn't follow the same route repeatedly through a specific wash system. A lion moves variably across its territory in response to prey distribution, cover availability, water access, and territorial boundary management. What the corridor produces is a route, a specific, linear, repeated route that shows up in 11 years of depredation data as a line rather than a distribution. A line is not what any territorial predator in the Trans-Pecos ecosystem produces. A line is what a migrating animal produces, or what an animal with a home range so large that the Trans-Pecos basin is simply a crossing point in a larger circuit produces. The behavioral profile of what's in the corridor, linear route, seasonal activity, movement between mountain ranges, consistent return to the same path over many years, is not a predator behavioral profile. It's a traveler's behavioral profile, something moving through the landscape on a route between destinations, the same route repeated across seasons and years, the same way any large animal with established seasonal ranges uses the terrain between them. This is the reframe that Eduardo's knowledge made possible for me. The corridor is not a hunting territory. It's a travel route. What I've been documenting is not a predator's territory, but a traveler's path, and the cattle losses that brought the pattern to my attention are not predatory in the sense of a lion making a kill in its own territory. They're incidental contact events, cattle in the wrong place at the wrong time on a route that was established and used by something else long before the cattle were there. The distinction matters because it changes what you do with the information. If what's in the corridor were a territorial predator, the management response would involve the predator's territory. Because what's in the corridor is a traveler on a route, the management response is exactly what Eduardo's family arrived at 4 generations ago. Know the route, know the schedule, keep cattle and people out of the route during the schedule. Not permanent exclusion. Seasonal, schedule-informed management. You don't close a highway because animals cross it. You know when the animals cross and you manage accordingly. I've been applying that management approach for the 10 years since Year 7's decision on the horse patrol, in the informal, unacknowledged way that I've been managing around the corridor's presence since I understood what it was. The depredation complaints from the ranchers I work with have decreased significantly in the years since I started providing better guidance on seasonal grazing patterns in the Central Basin, informed by my understanding of the corridor's active periods. Not eliminated. The route is long and the cattle operations in the basin are many and some of the losses are unavoidable given the terrain and the ranching practices. But reduced in a pattern consistent with the seasonal management principle working. Eduardo noticed. He mentioned it to me in year 14, with the specific satisfaction of someone whose grandfather's knowledge had been vindicated through someone else's professional application of it. You've been keeping them out of the wrong places at the wrong times. Yes, that's exactly what I've been doing. With data that the formal wildlife management literature doesn't have a framework for explaining, applied in practice through 17 years of patrol work in the central Trans-Pecos, producing outcomes consistent with what 4 generations of his family's direct management experience produced when the knowledge was intact. The knowledge works. Eduardo's family learned it through direct, multi-generational exposure to the corridor and its consequences. I learned it through formal wildlife management data and one kitchen table conversation. The outcome is the same. The cattle losses decrease when the cattle aren't on the old man's road during the old man's seasons. It's the most practical and the most directly useful thing I can tell you about 17 years in the Trans-Pecos. The knowledge is real, it's applicable, and it works. You don't need to see the old man to benefit from knowing his road and his schedule. The depredation data tells you the road. Eduardo's family knowledge tells you the schedule. The pronghorn tell you both, every day, with their feet. I want to tell you about the one time I went to the canyon at night. This was year 15, which I've been reluctant to include because it produced the incident I've been least sure how to describe, and I've been sitting on it for 2 years deciding whether to include it in an account at all. I was at the canyon above the spring at dusk, having come in to do a 3rd documentation visit of the impressions in the alluvial deposit above the spring. I'd timed the visit to make use of the late afternoon light, which is the best light for photographing track impressions in alluvial material. I finished the photography work before dark and was packing up to begin the hike out. It's a 45-minute hike from the canyon's lower end to the nearest trailhead access, comfortable in daylight and manageable in the dark with a good headlamp, which I had. I decided to stay at the spring for a few minutes before beginning the hike out. The spring is one of the most beautiful spots in my patrol area, an entirely unexpected green zone deep in a desert canyon, and I've sat by it many times when logistics allowed. I sat at the spring's edge and watched the light change as the sun dropped below the canyon rim, and the canyon went into the specific, deep desert shadow that precedes full dark. At approximately 20 minutes after the sun dropped below the rim, when the canyon was in shadow but there was still ambient light from the sky above, I heard the sound from further up the canyon. The same low-frequency, organized, sustained vocalization I'd heard from 400 meters on the horse patrol. Except not from 400 meters. From above the spring, in the upper canyon section I'd been stopping short of in every previous visit. Maybe 150 meters, considerably closer than I'd heard it before. I sat by the spring and did not move and did not make noise and did not turn on my headlamp. I sat in the gathering dark of a desert canyon in the active season and listened. The sound continued for approximately 4 minutes, intermittently, from the upper canyon above my position. At no point did it change distance. It stayed where it was, in the upper section, above the spring, in the section of the canyon I'd consistently chosen not to enter. And then it stopped. I waited for close to 15 minutes after it stopped, sitting in the full dark of the canyon, before I turned on my headlamp and began the hike out. I moved steadily and without looking back, which was a deliberate choice rather than fear. I've been on enough night patrols in enough remote country to know how to move efficiently in the dark when you need to cover ground and get back to a road. And looking back in a narrow canyon with a good headlamp doesn't show you anything you'd want to see at 150 meters and serves mainly to disorient you. I focused on the trail and moved steadily. What I heard for the first 4 minutes of the hike out, until the canyon opened up and the trail widened into the approach terrain, was nothing. The canyon was quiet behind me. Whatever had been vocalizing from the upper section had not moved, had not followed, had done exactly what it had done on the night patrol, vocalizing from its position, maintaining its distance, and then going silent. The same behavior in a radically different context, at a radically different proximity, with the same essential character. It doesn't follow. It doesn't close the distance. Whatever it does from its position, it does from its position and it stays there. That knowledge, the consistency of the non-approach, the maintained distance, the vocalization and silence pattern, is the thing that finally resolved for me, on the hike out of the canyon in year 15, the question I'd been holding since year 5. Whatever is in the corridor is not predatory toward human beings. I've been in the corridor's active zone for 17 years, in some of those years at the wrong times and the wrong hours, and I've never been approached, never been followed, never had any interaction that moved toward me rather than simply existing in my vicinity and then stopping. That's not the behavior of a thing that's looking for a confrontation. That's the behavior of a thing that knows you're there and notes your presence and continues doing what it's doing, with the same patient, established certainty of a creature that doesn't need to escalate anything because it has been in this landscape for long enough that nothing in the landscape is a genuine threat to it. I am not a threat to the old man. Nobody on horseback or in a truck or hiking into a canyon with a headlamp is a threat to something that has been in those mountains since before the mountains had the names we've given them. The maintained distance and the non-approach aren't caution on its part. They're courtesy. The same courtesy that an established, old, large presence in a landscape extends to the newer things that move through it, noting their presence, maintaining appropriate distance, neither threatening nor being threatened, going about the business of existing in a place that has been home long before any of the newer things arrived. Courtesy. That's the word I've settled on, 2 years after the canyon in year 15. The maintained distance, the consistent non-approach, the vocalization that announces presence without closing ground. It's a form of courtesy extended to the things that move through its territory. We're not a threat, and we're not prey, and we're not of sufficient significance to interrupt whatever it's doing. We're noted, at appropriate distance, and the noting continues until we move on. I find that both reassuring and, honestly, a little humbling. 17 years of careful professional observation of something that has, in its own assessment of the situation, extended me the courtesy of a maintained distance and a non-approach while going about its own business in a landscape that belongs to it in a way it has never belonged to me. That's the honest, full, 17-year picture. The old man's road, the old man's schedule, the old man's canyon, the old man's courtesy. I've been a temporary and inconsequential presence in a very old territory, trying to understand something that has been there since before the idea of understanding existed, and the understanding I've arrived at is this. It was here. It's here. It'll be here. Give it its road. Come home before dark. Trust the pronghorn. There are 4 things I want to add before I close this account, all of which I've been leaving out because they're harder to fit into the flow of the main narrative, but which belong here. The first is about the horses. I've been mentioning the horse from the Year 7 patrol in the context of the specific encounter that night, but the horse's response to the corridor is something that warrants more discussion on its own terms, because the horse is not the only one that has responded that way, and because horses have been in this landscape alongside human beings long enough to have their own relationship to what's in it. The working horses on the ranches in the central Trans-Pecos basin have, in my experience across 17 years, a consistent behavioral characteristic in the corridor that the ranchers I work with have all noted. The horses don't like the corridor. Not in a specific, reactive, acute way, not the spook of a fresh stimulus, but in the chronic, habitual way that prey animals express long-term awareness of a persistent feature of their environment. They move through the corridor with less ease than they move through comparable terrain elsewhere in the basin. They take direction less readily in the corridor's central section. And the specific behavioral tell that I've learned to read as the horse's awareness of the corridor, the slight tension in the back, the ears working toward a specific direction without any apparent stimulus, is consistent in every horse I've worked in that section, regardless of the horse's age, experience, or individual temperament. Multiple horses, across 17 years, in multiple separate visits to the corridor, all showing the same behavioral pattern in the same location. The horses know something is there. They've been calibrated to the corridor's presence the same way that the pronghorn herds have calibrated their distribution around it, not through individual learning, but through the specific, intergenerational transmission of learned threat assessment that occurs in social animals that pass behavioral knowledge from adults to young. The working horses of the Trans-Pecos have been in that landscape long enough and in close enough relationship with its contents to have integrated whatever is in the corridor into their understanding of the landscape. Horses that were born on the ranches in the basin, that have been worked by their current owners for their whole lives, that have never been in the corridor with a previous owner or in a context that could have produced individual learning, they still show the same response. The knowledge precedes the individual animal's experience of the corridor. It was there when the horse was born. I find the horse data, accumulated informally across 17 years of working them in the corridor, more compelling than the formal depredation data in some ways, because the horse data is harder to explain through any mechanism that doesn't require the corridor's presence to be real and persistent and known to the landscape's animal community at a level that transcends individual learning. The second thing is about the radio interference the deputy described. I've been sitting on this for a year because it's the element of the account that sounds most like something out of a movie rather than something from a wildlife manager's 17 years in the field, but the deputy's account was specific enough and long-tenured enough to be taken seriously as a data point. Radio interference in a specific geographic location, consistent across 15 years of county law enforcement using that section of road, is a real and documentable phenomenon with a limited set of possible causes. The common causes, terrain-related signal scattering, interference from specific man-made infrastructure, atmospheric effects, don't typically produce interference that is consistent in location, consistent in character, and consistent across years and terrain without significant man-made infrastructure in the specific area. I'm not a radio engineer. I can't tell you precisely what produces the interference that the deputy described and that I've observed myself at various points on patrols through the corridor. What I can tell you is that consistent, location-specific radio interference in a section of the central Trans-Pecos basin that corresponds to the corridor described by the depredation data and the traditional knowledge is an anomalous feature of that specific location, and that an anomalous feature corresponds to the other anomalous features I've been documenting for 17 years in the same location. I don't know what the connection is. I know the correlation exists. The third thing is about the Sky Island ecosystem and why the mountain ranges that flank the corridor matter. The Chihuahuan Mountains in Big Bend and the Davis Mountains to the north are Sky Islands, isolated mountain ranges in a sea of desert, where elevation produces a temperate ecosystem surrounded by arid lowland. Sky Islands in the Chihuahuan Desert region have some of the most extraordinary species assemblages in North America, partly because of the ecosystems they support and partly because they function as refugia, islands of habitat that persist through climate cycles that eliminate those same habitats in adjacent areas. Species survive in Sky Islands that have gone extinct from the surrounding landscape, holding on in the specific, protected conditions of the elevated terrain. The canyon that Eduardo identified as the corridor's northeast terminus, the canyon above the spring in the mountain range, is in an area that has some of the characteristics of a Sky Island refugium. Protected, water permanent, with access to higher elevation terrain and the cooler, wetter conditions that certain species require. If whatever has been using the corridor has a home range that spans the two mountain ranges connected by the desert crossing, the mountain ranges themselves are its stable habitat, and the desert basin is the crossing between stable habitats. Sky Island refugia have maintained isolated populations of species that were extirpated from surrounding areas for thousands of years. The Trans-Pecos Sky Islands are known to harbor relict populations, species that existed in broader ranges before climate changes contracted the suitable habitat into these isolated mountain remnants. Whatever is in the corridor may be a relict population of something that once occupied a much broader range across the southwestern landscape, now confined to the specific Sky Island refugia where the conditions of its survival persist, moving between them across a desert crossing that has been its route for as long as it has been in those mountains. This framing, which I've been developing across the last few years as I've learned more about the Sky Island ecology of the Chihuahuan Desert region, is the most coherent biological hypothesis I've been able to construct for what I've been observing. It doesn't require anything outside the standard framework of wildlife biology and conservation biogeography, relict populations in Sky Island refugia, seasonal movement between refugia across desert crossings, behavioral adaptations to minimize detection in a human-altered landscape. It requires only that whatever species is in those mountains is unknown to science, which in a region as undersurveyed as the Trans-Pecos' remote interior is not an unreasonable proposition. I'm not a taxonomist. I'm not going to make a species-level claim in this account. What I'm saying is that the behavioral ecology of what I've been documenting is consistent with a large, wide-ranging species using Sky Island refugia in the southern Rocky Mountain/Chihuahuan Desert region, and that this framing fits both the formal data I've collected and the traditional knowledge that Eduardo's family and the Apache man's account and the county's historical memory have contributed. An old, rare, wide-ranging species in a remote and undersurveyed landscape, known to the people who've lived in closest relationship with that landscape for long enough to have accumulated accurate knowledge of it, and unknown to the scientific institutions that have been in the region for a much shorter time. The fourth and final thing is about what I'm going to do with this account, because I've been thinking about that since I decided to write it. I'm not going to name the corridor more specifically than I have. I'm not going to give the coordinates of the canyon above the spring. I'm not going to identify Eduardo's family or the ranchers or the deputy sheriff by their actual names. And I'm not going to file this account with any official agency or use it as the basis for any formal management intervention in the corridor. The reasons are the same reasons I've given in every account I've given of these experiences in their respective landscapes. The corridor is not a management problem. It's a feature of the landscape that the landscape's long-tenured residents have known how to manage around for generations, and the management approach that works is the management approach Eduardo's family developed and that I've been applying informally for the last 10 years. You don't improve on four-generation traditional knowledge of a specific feature of a specific landscape by replacing it with a formal institutional intervention, because formal institutional interventions require categories that don't exist for this. And without the right categories, the intervention becomes something else, a debunking effort, a sensational investigation, a land management action that serves no productive purpose and that creates exactly the kind of attention around the corridor that it doesn't need. What I want is for this account to exist, accurately and completely, as a record of 17 years in the central Trans-Pecos by a wildlife professional who paid careful attention to what that landscape contained. The record exists now. What happens with it is up to whoever reads it. Come home from the Trans-Pecos. Trust the pronghorn. Give the old man his road. That's 17 years. That's everything I have. One more thing. The Trans-Pecos produces some of the most extraordinary night skies in the continental United States. The McDonald Observatory sits in the Davis Mountains for a reason. The combination of elevation, dry air, and minimal light pollution creates viewing conditions that are among the best anywhere in North America. When you're in the desert basin at night, away from any road or structure, the sky is not the sky that most people see. It's a sky that has depth to it, layer after layer of stars going back to the edge of everything. The Milky Way visible as a physical structure rather than a vague haze, the occasional meteor trail, the slow movement of satellites tracking across the stars. It is one of the most beautiful things I've seen in 17 years in the field. I've seen that sky from the Central Basin during the corridor's active seasons, during night patrols when the work took me into the corridor in years before I made the decision to stop going in alone at night. And on several of those occasions, looking at that sky while the desert was quiet around me, I've been aware that whatever was in the corridor was also out there under the same sky, looking at the same stars, in the same landscape that we've both been in, one of us for 17 years and one of us for much, much longer. There is something both humbling and, in a strange way, right about sharing a sky with something that has been in the same desert for longer than any category I have for it. We're both in the same desert, under the same stars, and the desert belongs to both of us exactly to the degree that either of us actually belongs to it, which is to say, I'm a guest. The old man is home. Treated accordingly, that's all. There's something I haven't told you that I want to tell you now, because this is the honest account, and the honest account includes the things that are hardest to say. In year 16, on an afternoon patrol through the southwest section of the corridor, I found a track that was fresh enough that the edges hadn't dried in the afternoon sun. Clear, unambiguous. Large, bipedal, in the dry caliche at the edge of a wash crossing. I photographed it, and then I did something I've never done in 17 years of track documentation. I stepped around it. I stepped around it carefully, moved past the crossing point, and continued my patrol. I did not collect measurements beyond the photograph. I did not flag the location for follow-up. I did not note it in my patrol log beyond a standard notation about checking a wash crossing. I'm aware that this is not the behavior of a scientist maximizing data collection. I'm aware that the photograph I have is the best single piece of physical evidence in 17 years of documenting the corridor, and that I walked away from the most complete documentation opportunity I've had because something in me decided, at the edge of that wash crossing in the afternoon sun, that the right thing to do was step around the track and keep moving. I can't fully account for that decision. What I can tell you is that it arrived the same way every other decision I've described in this account arrived, preconsciously, before any explicit reasoning, with the quality of something my nervous system had worked out before my conscious mind was invited into the process. Step around it. Keep moving. That's the appropriate thing. I think it was right. I think 17 years in the Trans-Pecos, and the accumulated weight of Eduardo's knowledge, and the traditional knowledge, and the depredation data, and the canyon impressions, and the pronghorn distribution, had produced in me, without my consciously deciding to produce it, the same practical relationship to the corridor that the people with the most complete and longest-standing knowledge of it arrived at. You note it. You note it carefully, and you keep moving. You don't push past what the evidence requires. You don't collect for collection's sake in a territory that isn't yours. The photograph is in my files. It's enough. I stepped around the track and kept moving. Come home from the Trans-Pecos. Trust the pronghorn. Give the old man his road. 17 years. That's all of it.